Okay, again, welcome. Really good to see you all here. Hope you're having a great summer. We're in a series at the moment called Stories That Jesus Told. We're looking at parables in particular that Jesus told that are recorded for us in the Christian scriptures. And we're going to look at one of them today. It's interesting to think as we look at interpreting these parables, these really incredible stories, they're genius stories really. When we think about interpreting them, it's worth bearing in mind, why did Jesus tell parables? Why did he speak in parables? At one level, they're very accessible. That may be why Jesus told them. They're about very commonplace things, everyday things in that setting, in that first century setting. They're quite simple stories, often very short. And even the longer ones are somewhat repetitious, have a pattern to them. So they're probably very easy to remember. And people undoubtedly told them again because we have these traditions, oral traditions that eventually got written down and produced some of the Gospels that we have today. So there's something very accessible about them. But they're also somewhat obscure, even enigmatic, that they might have an obvious apparent meaning, but they have layers of meaning too. There's twists and turns. They're a little bit subversive. We did a series on parables a few years ago, and we called it Beneath the Surface, because the meaning might not be the most apparent one. So they require a little bit of thought, a little bit of investigation. And some people think, some scholars have suggested that Jesus taught like this in a subversive way because he didn't want to get caught out by the authorities, whether that was the religious authorities or the political authorities. So he could he used innuendo so that he could say, well, I didn't really mean that, I meant this. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but certainly what happens as we read these parables is at least a couple of things. One is we get drawn into them because we tend to take sides. In the way the story is told, there are certain apparently innocent parties or characters that we would normally side with, we might normally identify with. And Jesus kind of uses that to kind of set us up. A little bit like saying, there were these, in the famous story of the Good Samaritan, there was the priest came along, and then the Levite came along, and then a Samaritan comes along, and we're set up to think, like that, in that first century context, first century Jewish context. And then there's a big twist. So we sort of get caught out. And the ancient Hebrew prophets did that a lot. They would use those kind of techniques to make a point. We kind of almost condemn ourselves, if you like, by pointing the finger at others. So that's one thing that happens. And we might see that a little bit in the parable we're going to look at today. And then the other thing is, of course, if they're a little bit cryptic, a little bit enigmatic, we have to explore them more. We get drawn into them. We have to think about it. And last week, Ruth looked at this scripture from the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus actually answers the question, why do you talk in parables? He says, the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. Sounds very unfair. Why is it that this is why I speak to them in parables? Though seeing, they do not see. And he's quoting the prophet Isaiah here. About to. Though hearing they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will ever be hearing, but never understanding. You will ever be seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. So what Jesus seems to be saying here is if you're just like, I don't want to have to work too hard at this, I'm not even necessarily all that interested in the truth of this story, then you're probably not going to hear anything. But if you're kind of, I'm leaning in, I want to know, I want to, what is this all about? I'm not just going to take the most immediate or most prevailing meaning, the most popular meaning. I want to be challenged. That means we've got ears to hear. And we're more likely to get something from it. So that's kind of a posture for us all, I think, including me, to take as we look at these parables. And it means that we have to be careful, I think, as always with the Bible. We've always got to be careful about interpreting the Bible, because we've got to take a humble approach, because it may not necessarily mean what we immediately think it means. We need to be careful. And with the parables in particular, we have to be careful, right? Firstly, because there may be more than one meaning, right? We shouldn't be surprised by that, because the gospel writers use different parables and other stories about Jesus in different ways to make different points. So they're adapting the material So, for instance, the parable of the lost sheep, a very famous parable, is used by Matthew in Matthew 18 in a certain way, and a different way by Luke in Luke 15. So, same story, same parable, but making different points. So they use the material in different ways. So it's not surprising that actually in the parable, any one parable itself, there might be multiple meanings. It also means that probably, and we're going to talk about a parable today that I think has a very traditional meaning to it that's been assigned to it, which almost by definition is probably not helpful, right? Because if these are subversive stories that are meant to make us think, that have twists and turns to them, then they need constant reinterpretation. So any one traditional interpretation may not be the most helpful one. And we have to kind of bring them alive in our own present day. Have to bring them alive in our own context and our own lives. So we're going to try and do that together today. We've also got to remember, of course, and I think this will be relevant to this parable, that we don't actually have Jesus' words in the Bible. That might sound very heretical, but what we have is people's records of Jesus' words. Jesus spoke Aramaic. So when we hear the parable today, Jesus would have shared that parable in Aramaic. It was remembered by somebody and passed on, probably as an oral tradition. It eventually, at some point, maybe got written down as a tradition in its collections of sayings about Jesus. And then the writer of Luke draws on that, whether it was the oral tradition or something written down, and uses it along with probably Mark's gospel and some other source material to put the gospel that we call the Gospel of Luke together. And this parable is from some source. We don't know exactly what that source is, but the author of Luke is using it. So we've got to remember that whenever we read a parable, we're getting a perspective on something, and we shouldn't be worried about that. It doesn't mean we shouldn't trust it. It's just that it could help us to know that as we think about interpretation. And I think today's parable is actually a point in case about that. Okay, well, let's jump into the parable. So let's put it up. It's in Luke 18. I think probably a lot of us may well have heard this parable before and might well have, as I have, a sort of a tradition of what it means, which we'll explore a little bit. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, "Grant me justice against my accuser." For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, "Though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow is bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming." And the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" So that's the parable, just a few short verses. So the traditional interpretation of this, and certainly what I've grown up understanding this to mean, and I wonder if that is probably true for a lot of us, is that this is a parable about prayer. So there's a little bit of commentary at the beginning before Jesus starts talking, where the author of Luke says, Jesus told them a story about not giving up on prayer. So the author's kind of given it away from the beginning, unless that's a bit of a decoy, possibly. But then the parable is really, it's about this, a poor widow, an innocent widow, who we all immediately identify with, who is asking for something, and that's justice, wanting protection, help, the right thing to be done. And the judge, who doesn't care about people, is eventually worn down and acts in her favor. And the moral of the story is just keep praying, don't give up praying, and eventually God will relent and grant our wishes, what we've been praying for. And that may be the meaning. It may be one meaning. It's one way of interpreting this parable. But it's a little unsatisfying. There's a few loose ends to tie up. There's something about it that doesn't quite ring true. I mean, what does it say about prayer? It kind of infers that prayer is nagging God for stuff, right? And we did a whole 3 weeks on prayer a few weeks ago, and we worked out that it wasn't about nagging God, right? So we could study and think about prayer for centuries, and I think we would discover that it's at least something more than just constantly asking God for stuff until we get it, right? And that's sort of implied a little bit in this interpretation. What does it say about God? It kind of implies that God sort of, no. Oh, go on then, I'll do what you want. It's a little bit petty, a little bit toxic even, the sort of the dynamic, the relationship there. And then there's that sort of weird ending where Jesus seems to be saying, yeah, keep praying because, God's going to wreak vengeance on your enemies, ultimately. The Son of Man is going to come, and it's apocalyptic. That last section is very apocalyptic. Whenever Jesus starts talking about the Son of Man, he's talking about kind of the end of the world and apocalypse and all that kind of stuff. You can imagine people, when they were listening to Jesus, once he used the term Son of Man, they're like, oh boy, here he goes. We're going to have this apocalyptic talk now. So anyway, so I don't know about you, but it's not, that traditional interpretation isn't particularly satisfying. It's one, but it's not necessarily the only one. So what we're going to do, we're just going to try and have another look at it. And before we dive any deeper, let's look at it in another English translation. Okay, so we're hearing the Aramaic words of Jesus that have been translated into Greek, translated for us into English. We just read the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Just let's read the New International Version. So this is just the same Greek, but a different way of translating it into the English. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. Okay, same thing. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with a plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see she gets justice, so she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Okay, so same story, same kind of gist, but a few slight differences. I don't know whether you picked up on those. One is the way the opponent, or the person who was called the accuser of the widow in the first version, is now called an adversary. So we get a bit of ambiguity about, is the widow innocent? I mean, in the first version, it's kind of like she's accused, she's the victim here. It's a little less victim-like in this other translation. And we also hear that the judge, in the first translation, it said he doesn't fear God and he has no respect for people. In this version, it says he doesn't care what people think. Now, if you think about not respecting people, there's hardly ever a case for that's okay, right? It can actually be appropriate not to respect people. I mean, you could make that case perhaps, but we should always have at least a modicum of respect for people, even the people we disagree with, even people we don't particularly like. But to say we don't care what people think, sometimes that's inappropriate, right? If I just say, I don't care what you think, that's not very good. But what if it's like, I'm going to make the right decision because I don't care what people think? It has a slight different connotation, right? So already we're seeing a little bit of ambiguity in this story, and there's more there too. The word attack is used. The judge is kind of afraid that the widow's going to attack him, not just wear him out. In the first version, it's going to wear me down. You could kind of see that. It's this innocent person coming and coming and coming. And now it's like, she might attack me. It's kind of, whoa, that doesn't sound, what's that about? So there's this ambiguity that we're picking up on already. So what we're going to do, we're going to look a little bit closer at the story and at the text. And we're going to do that in four pretty straightforward ways. One, we'll look a bit closer at the widow. What can we say about the widow? We're not really going to say anything too much about the opponent because they're sort of a person in the background. We only have the widow's perspective on that person. That person doesn't have a voice in the story. So we'll look a bit closer at the widow. We'll look a bit closer at the judge. We'll look a bit closer at some of the languages, just 2 words in the whole passage that we'll home in on. And then we'll have a little closer look at the structure of the passage, how it's put together. And then we'll draw some conclusions about what the correct interpretation is. I'm not going to come up with a correct interpretation. What I mean is, there may be other ways of looking at this passage, and we can think through some of those and maybe apply them into our own lives. So let's go in a little bit deeper on the widow. So the widow, I think, probably for most of us, as soon as we start hearing this story, we identify with the widow, or we're on the widow's side. And whether we've got a religious background or a biblical background or not, I think that's probably true for most of us. We feel sorry for the widow, that she's a widow. She's lost her spouse. And if we have some historical context, often, very often, widows, because they weren't married anymore, would not have a source of income because it was the husband, the male in the family, that was bringing in the income. So they were vulnerable people. If you look at the Hebrew scriptures, there's many scriptures about taking care of widows. So do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. If you do and they cry out to me, I will certainly hear their cry. Many scriptures in the Hebrew scriptures about defending and protecting widows. However, a more feminist perspective, so certain feminist scholars would say that, yeah, that's a good thing because many widows were destitute, were poor historically. But it's kind of patronizing to think of widows as victims and to think of them as being dependent and needing support all the time implies that they don't have agency of their own, that it sort of brushes all widows with one stroke of poverty, and that sort of runs against the grain of many of the widows in stories in the Hebrew scriptures. Widows like Tamar in Genesis 38. In the book of Ruth, you have Naomi and Ruth. In the book of Kings, we have the widow of Zarephath. So these are all strong women with agency who get stuff done, who are the protagonists of the story. So we need to, in other words, according to some scholars, be careful about just immediately thinking widow equals victim, widow equals weakness, widow equals dependent. Likewise in the Christian scriptures, so in the book of James, again, one of many admonitions to take care of widows. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. But again, a more feminist perspective there would be that actually perhaps that is patriarchal, that's paternalistic. And in some of the letters that were written by various people, often the Apostle Paul to churches about this kind of thing, they were based on really a patriarchal system where widows were encouraged to be dependent. We'll look after you, don't worry. Okay, now I don't know what the reality, I wasn't around then, right? I don't know what the reality was, just sharing what some perspectives are that might kind of swivel a little bit the way we look at widow. Because as soon as the widow's mentioned in the story Jesus told, we're kind of alerted to victim, poor person, innocent person, we're on the widow's side. And remember, these parables are enigmatic. They twist and turn, and they kind of catch us out. So we're going to be alert to that. The reality is we don't know too much about the widow. We don't know that the widow's poor. It doesn't say she's poor. In fact, there's an allusion to the fact that she might be somewhat well off because she keeps coming back to the judge. Remember, I think Jesus is making up this story. I don't think Jesus has read this story somewhere, a news report. I think Jesus is making this up, so just for the record. But Jesus doesn't say a poor, destitute widow. It's just a widow. And the fact that she can keep coming back to the judge means she has some kind of resource. She's not working every hour that God sends because she's so poor. That's one perspective. We don't know that she's innocent. She has an adversary, and she's going to a judge about an adversary. It may be that the adversary is the innocent party. We don't know, right? We're sort of reading into the story because of the context that we have for the term widow. So again, just got to be careful. Let's think about the judge. So the second sort of digging down a little bit deeper. When we think about the judge, clearly we have lots of evidence from ancient literature that judges could be corrupt. And they would sort of take bribes, build up wealth for the, in order, make decisions that basically were beneficial for them and would get them money. I think that's probably not surprising. But again, that's not how this judge is described. He's described at the end of the story as unjust. But he's not called that at the beginning. He's just called not God-fearing and doesn't care what people think. So in some respects, we're set up with this judge as somebody who, maybe he doesn't respect anybody, as some translations say. Maybe he's just this villainous kind of character, or he's impartial. It could be that he's impartial. And it could be that the reason he's described at the end of the story as unjust, rather than at the beginning, because that would be a fine time. There was an unjust judge who didn't care about God, didn't care about people. That would be a fine way to start it. But it doesn't. It just says he doesn't fear God, he doesn't care about what people think, and at the end he's described as unjust, which implies, I think, that it's because of his decision that he's described as unjust. In other words, perhaps he caves to the demand and lets the widow have what she wants, perhaps at the expense, potentially, of an innocent party. And that makes him unjust. He's kind of just worn out, he's looking after himself. Okay, they're not saying that's the exact way to look at it, but there's question marks over this already. So let's dig a little bit into the language. I mentioned we'll look at a couple of words to get perhaps some more insight about the widow and the judge. Okay, so let's think about the widow's plea. What is the widow asking for? So that's in the second part of verse 3, the widow's plea. So in the New International Version, we're going to look at this in some different translations, different English translations. Here's a plea. Grant me justice against my adversary. Okay, that seems like a good thing to ask for, an innocent thing to ask for. What does it say? Let's go on to the next one in the Message. My rights are being violated. Protect me. That really implies she's the victim, right? So let's look at another one. This one's an interesting translation. It's called the Easy English Bible. You may have ever read that. Easy meaning easy English, not easy Bible, because the Bible's never easy. But here's what it says here. Somebody is doing bad things against me. Please keep me safe from that person. Okay, so there's an implication in that translation. Let's turn to the good old King James Version, the 21st century King James Version. Avenge me on mine adversary. Right, so it's a very different feel, that last one. Right, we don't often go to the King James much at Cedar Ridge, but it's an interpretation of the Greek. Avenge me on mine adversary. It has a more sinister feel to it. It doesn't really feel like a victim particularly. And it uses that word avenge instead of the word justice, which is used in most of the other translations. Now that word in the Greek is ekdikeo. And it's not the usual word for justice. It's unusual, it's strange that all these other interpretations, all these other translations, translate ekdikeo as justice, because it usually means vengeance, retribution, punishment. It's only used 6 times in the whole of the Christian scriptures. Twice here, in Luke, once in this plea of the widow, and then once when the judge responds by saying, I'll grant you her justice. It's perhaps better translated, I'll grant her vengeance. She's asking for vengeance. The other 4 occasions it's used, twice in Paul, in Romans and in 2 Corinthians, and a couple of times in the book of Revelation, which has a lot of kind of vengeance, apocalyptic kind of language in it, right? Let's look at the Romans example where ekdikeo is used. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. Okay, ekdikeo. My dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Okay, so I think we read that and we think that sounds really wonderful. Sounds really wonderful. But actually this, in the Greek, looking at, it's the same language, the widow is actually asking for vengeance. It seems to be going beyond just justice, but asking for some kind of retribution, some kind of punishment on the enemy. And the word that could have been used, like when the judge is described as unjust later in the passage, that's ardikia, so sort of a just or unjust. It's from a similar root, dikia, and we get from that the word justice, which is diakosune, and that's the word that's usually used in the Christian scriptures, the Greek word for justice. It's not used here. It's revenge, it's vengeance that's used. So it's interesting that the English translations could potentially be misleading and therefore give us a different spin on the parable. So the language here is important. Okay, let's dig a little deeper. So from that term, ekdikeo, we get the sense that the widow might not be 100% innocent here. Let's look at the judge. The judge's fear, which is in the second part of verse 5. Okay, if we look at the translation we read right at the beginning, the New Revised Standard updated version, I will grant her justice, that's ekdikeo again, actually, I will grant her vengeance, so that she may not wear me out by continually coming. So, he's just like, I don't want to be worn out by all this. Let's look at another one. This is the New International Version, which we also read. I will see that she gets justice, vengeance, so that she won't eventually come and attack me. So that's a little more, whoa, this woman's going to attack him? And then a third one here from the Message, I'd better do something and see that she gets justice. Otherwise, I'm going to end up beaten black and blue by her pounding. That's a little laughable in one sense, except that hupopiazo is the word here, and it's a term borrowed from, so this whole wearing down or attacking or beaten black and blue, hupopiazo is a word borrowed from ancient boxing. And it means to give a black eye, to beat black and blue. I mean, this Message translation is really getting at what that language is. So again, this feels a little violent, right? This doesn't feel all that innocent. This feels like aggression and not something that we'd associate with an innocent party. So perhaps this isn't so much a parable about prayer and getting what you want through prayer. I mean, it has something to do with that, as we'll see, but perhaps it's a parable about justice and mercy and the fact that there's something in all of us that thinks we are the innocent party, that thinks we are right, that secretly or overtly want vengeance, even if it's just bad stuff happening to our enemies or them getting their comeuppance. And actually, Jesus is challenging that. Jesus is saying, we may think we're innocent. He's catching us out, I think, potentially here. By saying, we identify with the person who's demanding justice that actually turns out to be vengeance. And we always think we're in the right, and our enemies are wrong. And we all potentially have that kind of hatred that wants a vindictive punishment, a retribution on the people that are against us or who disagree with us, even maybe people we don't know personally. And Jesus is obviously about something completely different. Marcus Aurelius, the 2nd century Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, said, the best revenge is to be unlike the one who performed the injury. That sounds very Christ-like. In other words, Jesus is all about turning the other cheek, about forgiving, about returning hatred with love to stop the cycle of vengeance, not to perpetuate it. And perhaps this is what the parable's about. Let's just look at the structure. We said we would go a little further, a little deeper around the widow, the judge, the language, and the structure, and then we'll wrap up and talk about what are perhaps some ways we can interpret this. So the story, it's only 8 verses, and it's really broken down into 3 sections. So this first section, verse 1, is the setup. This is clearly the author Luke giving us some context. It's not Jesus' words, right? Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. And I think this is a parable about that too, as we'll see. But it's bigger and deeper and more enigmatic than that. So the author has set us up here. And I think perhaps intentionally or not, it's a little bit of a decoy. It sort of makes everything very, very simple for us. But that's the intro, the narrative intro. Then we have the story itself. And this, most scholars would agree, from verse 2 to verse 5, that's most likely the saying that was remembered, possibly recorded, written down, but at least remembered in an oral tradition of Jesus. In a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, "Grant me justice against my adversary." For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so she won't eventually come and attack me." So that's the story that Jesus told, most likely. But then the author of Luke goes on in verses 6 to 8 to put words, potentially at least, put words in Jesus' mouth, where Jesus explains the parable. Now, Jesus didn't tend to explain parables. That's the whole point of parables. They're enigmatic. What do you make of it? Jesus occasionally did explain a parable, like the parable of the sower, for instance, but that was at the request of his disciples, who had probably heard the parable, didn't have a clue what it meant, and thought, somebody's going to ask us, and we don't want to sound stupid, so tell us what it means. This doesn't really kind of sound like Jesus. So maybe this is Luke kind of having Jesus say this as a way of kind of rounding the story off. But it says, the Lord said, "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about vengeance?" That's the word there, ekdikeo, "for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night. Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly, vengeance. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth?" So that's a kind of a strange ending. That does sound like, keep praying for vengeance on your enemies. But maybe, given what we've just said about the rest of the passage that's gone before, maybe Jesus is using irony here. Maybe Jesus is saying, look, you keep, and remember, the Gospel of Luke is written after Jesus' time, when the church is very young and being persecuted. And this seems to be almost like people are praying for vengeance on their persecutors. And the author here is saying, and having Jesus say, do you know what you're asking for? If your prayers are for vengeance, do you really want those prayers to be fulfilled? Do you really want to wreak retribution and vengeance on anybody? Is that my way? And that ending there of, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth, is perhaps saying, perhaps faith is about forgiveness. Perhaps faith is about perseverance despite the opposition, despite the injustice, and not caving in to that injustice by returning hatred with hatred, or returning anger and aggression with more anger and aggression. And so this parable really kind of captures us at a place where I think we all find ourselves, which is wanting vengeance, if we're really honest. And so this is a parable about prayer, and I don't think any single one of us would pray, "God, smite my enemies," right? If prayer is talking to God, there are moments when we go, "I'm going to talk to God." And in those moments, we become all sort of religious, don't we? We don't say, "God, I hate that person, smite them, bring down vengeance on them." But if prayer is actually communion with God, as we've been exploring, if prayer is perhaps a state of being, if prayer is kind of an existential reality that we live in, where it's communion with God, then I have to confess I'm constantly praying prayers like that. Because in my private moments, I have those feelings. In my private moments, I have those thoughts. And so it is a parable about prayer, but it is a parable about mercy and justice. And so let's look at some options that we might have then, as we close out here, some interpretive options. I'm not saying what the right one is, but I think in this short parable, we have lots of potential interpretations of lots of potential challenges. One interpretation is prayer is all about badgering God until God caves. That's one interpretation. You can tell by the way I've worded that I don't really think it's a bit unfair putting it like that. Perhaps a better way to put that kind of interpretation would be, don't give up on prayer because it takes time, even with God. That might be what this parable is about. That it's not badgering God, it's just being patient and in that communion, in that state of communion with God, being patient. Here's another interpretation. God will eventually wreak vengeance on our opponents. That's one way of looking at this. That's one way of interpreting that ending. Or we see it as, given the context of the rest of the passage, Jesus is being ironic. Jesus is exposing us, if you like, and our sense of requirement for vengeance. 4, be careful about equating preferred outcomes that benefit you with justice. Right? So we all think we're right, but we have to be careful about that. I think this parable is encouraging us to explore that. I won't say any more than that because I don't want to be prescriptive. These are questions. 5, in seeking justice, don't be manipulative or vengeful. Maybe the widow is innocent, is right, has been treated unjustly, and it's right for her to seek justice, but it's also possible to go beyond that to vengeance and punishment. And 6, thinking about the judge, don't let fear prevent you from acting justly. As we said earlier, maybe the reason the judge is called unjust isn't because he's always unjust. He's not described that way at the beginning. He's unjust because he caved in to pressure, which might have been at the expense of the nameless, faceless person in the background who was innocent. We don't know. But that could be a takeaway interpretation. Backing away from it all, I just wrote out like something for me, what I think this means. And in the discussion questions this week, there's an exercise to kind of just sort of look through the passage and what does it mean to you, and to try to formulate something that can be a personal challenge to you. And here's my take on it. I think this is what Jesus is saying. Don't be discouraged and don't give up in the struggle for the way of love. Even in the face of injustice and opposition. Stay in constant and vulnerable communion with God. That's the prayer. Stay true to the cause. And don't regress into the way of vengeance and punishment. And I think at a personal level, at a national level, at an international level, with all the disagreement, all the polarization, all the hatred, it's so easy, I think, to cross that line into vengeance, into hatred, where we just perpetuate the very problem that we're trying to solve. So this is a genius story, I think, and I'm not saying that's the right interpretation. Okay, that's how it challenges me personally, right? But this is a genius story that I think gets to the very heart of the human condition, and we unfortunately kind of dismiss it as a parable about just keep on praying for stuff and God will eventually relent and do it. It's just way deeper than that, way more challenging than that. And I think we also know that prayer just doesn't work like that, right? Because many of us, including myself, have been praying for certain things for ages and they've not happened, right? So, and we're in this process of exploring prayer from a different perspective. So anyway, we're going to take communion now. We do this every week. We have gluten-free crackers and fruit juice at the front and in the middle here. If you got a flyer when you came in this morning, just check that out if you're not familiar with the different stations we have around the room. But there's other ways we can all engage. This is a time when we can all respond in different ways. So you can light candles at the back. There's a place to write out laments. There's a couple of racial justice prayer stations at the front here. Lots of different things that we can do. So just check those out in the flyer. But the reason we take communion every week is simply this. We want to remember Jesus and Jesus' way, Jesus' way of love, Jesus' way of forgiveness, not vengeance, Jesus' way of justice, real justice, not vengeance. And so, doing this every week, we sort of come back to this little ceremony that is just crackers and juice. In one sense, insignificant, but in another sense, profound, because it recenters us on Jesus, because we're followers of Jesus, followers of this incredible way of love. So let's allow ourselves to recenter in whatever way seems appropriate for us, especially in light of the parable that we've just heard. I'm going to pray, and then please just come forward, either to the front or to the middle. You can eat and drink together. Some people like to do that. It's totally okay to grab a little cup and a cracker and go back to your seat and just do that on your own. Either way is fine, but feel free to respond in the way you see fit after I've prayed here. Let's pray. Jesus, we are in awe of you and the profundity of the love you embodied. You didn't just talk about it, you lived it out. And so we simply ask that your love, your truth, your reality would permeate every part of our broken being, every part of us that wants revenge, every part of us that doesn't want to let go, that doesn't want to forgive, every part of us that clings to being right rather than